The auditorium buzzed with the electric anticipation of 300 families, their voices weaving together into a symphony of pride and celebration. Sarah Chen Martinez sat in the third row, her fingers smoothing the wrinkles from her navy dress for the dozenth time, her eyes scanning the sea of blue caps and gowns on the stage. Somewhere among those graduates sat her son Michael, her miracle, her everything, about to receive his diploma from Stanford University with a degree in biomedical engineering. She had arrived 2 hours early, claiming the perfect seats with military precision. 2 seats. Always 2 seats. For 18 years of school plays, soccer games, science fairs, and now this, the culmination of everything they had worked toward. "Excuse me, ma'am." A woman with silver hair and kind eyes leaned toward her from the row behind. "Is someone sitting there?" Sarah's hand instinctively moved to protect the vacant seat, her wedding ring catching the harsh fluorescent light. "Yes," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the crowd. "My husband. He'll be here." But even as the words left her lips, she knew they tasted like lies. David's last text had arrived at 6:47 that morning. "Emergency at the firm. Can't make it. Tell Michael I'm proud." 32 years of marriage, 23 years of parenthood, and this was how he chose to show up? Do a hastily typed message that felt more like a business memo than a father's love. The opening chords of Pomp and Circumstance filled the auditorium, and Sarah's heart lurched as the graduates began their processional. She rose with everyone else, her phone pressed against her chest as if it might vibrate with an apology, an explanation, anything that might fill the David-shaped hole in this moment. Her eyes swept frantically across the sea of faces until she found him. Michael, tall and proud in his cap and gown, his smile radiant as he marched down the aisle. Their eyes met across the crowded space, and Michael's face lit up with pure joy. He was looking for his father, she realized with a sharp pang of recognition. His gaze swept to the empty seat beside her, and she watched his expression falter for just a moment before he forced the smile back into place. That brave, beautiful smile that had carried him through his father's missed bedtime stories, absent coaching sessions, and forgotten promises. Sarah lifted her phone and waved it slightly, mouthing, "He's watching," because the lie felt kinder than the truth. Michael nodded and gave her a thumbs up, and she felt her heart crack just a little wider. The ceremony unfolded like a dream sequence, speakers droning about futures and possibilities, while Sarah sat suspended in the peculiar grief of public abandonment. Around her, couples held hands, fathers beamed with pride, mothers dabbed at tears with carefully prepared tissues. She was an island of singular experience in an ocean of paired joy, and every shared glance between other parents felt like a reminder of what was missing. When they called Michael's name, Michael David Martinez, summa cum laude biomedical engineering, Sarah shot to her feet like she'd been launched from a cannon. Her hands flew to her mouth as tears spilled over, hot and relentless. He had done it! Her boy, their boy, had conquered every challenge, exceeded every expectation, and achieved something neither she nor David had ever dared dream when they were his age. "That's my son," she called out, her voice cracking with pride and pain. "That's my beautiful son." Other parents turned to smile at her, recognizing the universal language of maternal pride, but their glances lingered a beat too long on her singular celebration. Michael walked across that stage with the confidence of a young man who had earned his place in the world. But Sarah saw the quick scan he did of the audience, still looking, still hoping his father might have materialized in the final moments. After the ceremony, as families clustered on the lawn for photographs and tearful embraces, Sarah found herself swept into Michael's arms. He lifted her off her feet in a hug that spoke of gratitude and love and all the words they hadn't needed to say over the years. "Mom, we did it," he whispered into her hair, and she felt the weight of that plural pronoun, the acknowledgement that they had been a team of two, carrying each other toward this moment. "You did it, sweetheart," she corrected gently, pulling back to cup his face in her hands. "You amazing, brilliant, wonderful boy. You did this." "Where's Dad?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and Sarah watched Michael's eyes do that familiar dance of hope and resignation that had become his default expression when it came to his father. "Emergency at work," she said, hating how easily the practiced explanation rolled off her tongue. "But he's so proud, Michael. He wanted to be here more than anything." Michael nodded, accepting the familiar explanation with practiced grace. This was their pattern: David's absence, Sarah's explanation, Michael's acceptance. They had become experts in the choreography of emotional accommodation. "Want me to get someone to take our picture?" a nearby father offered, and Sarah felt a flush of gratitude for this stranger's kindness. "That would be wonderful, thank you." As they posed together on the sun-drenched lawn, Michael's arm around her shoulders, Sarah thought about all the photographs that had come before this one. Birthday parties where she'd had to work twice as hard to fill the frame with joy. Holiday mornings where she'd been both gift giver and memory maker. School events where she'd learned to be enough parent for two people. The camera clicked, capturing their moment of triumph. But Sarah knew that when Michael looked at this picture years from now, he would remember not just what was in the frame, but what was missing from it. Later, at the family dinner she'd planned at Michael's favorite restaurant, it was just the two of them, at a table set for three. The empty chair seemed to grow more pronounced as the evening wore on, an unwelcome guest that drew attention to itself through its very absence. "Mom," Michael said suddenly, setting down his fork and looking at her with those serious eyes that reminded her so much of her own father. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything, sweetheart." "Why do you stay?" The question hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her wineglass tremble in her hand. In all their years of navigating David's emotional unavailability, Michael had never asked her this directly. He had accepted their family dynamic with the resilience of a child who adapts to survive. But sitting here now as a grown man, he was finally ready to voice what had probably been building inside him for years. "Because I love him," I said automatically, the response I'd given myself 1,000 times in quiet moments of doubt. "But does he love you back?" Michael's voice was gentle but unrelenting. "Really, love you, because love shows up, Mom. Love doesn't leave you sitting alone at your son's graduation." I stared at my beautiful, perceptive son and felt the carefully constructed walls around my heart begin to crumble. How many years had I spent protecting him from the truth about their parents' marriage? How many excuses had I made? How many disappointments had I absorbed and transformed into something more palatable?
"It's complicated, Michael." "Is it?" He leaned forward and she could see the young man he'd become overlaying the boy she remembered. "Because from where I sit, it looks pretty simple. He chooses work. Every time. Over you, over me, over us. And you choose to let him." The words stung because they carried the weight of truth, but they also carried something else, a love so fierce and protective that it made her chest ache. Her son, her magnificent son, was trying to save her from herself. "There are things you don't understand," she began, but Michael shook his head. "Then help me understand, because I'm about to start my own life, Mom," and Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, like a tectonic plate finding new ground. For 23 years, she had been Michael's example of what a woman, a wife, a mother should be. She had taught him through her actions what love looked like, what sacrifice meant, what strength could endure. But sitting here now, looking into his earnest face, she realized she might have taught him the wrong lessons entirely. What kind of love was she modeling for him? What kind of partnership was she showing him to expect, to accept, to perpetuate? The restaurant continued to buzz around them, other families celebrating their graduates, but Sarah felt suspended in this moment of reckoning. Her son's question hung in the air like a challenge, like an invitation. like a door opening onto a future she hadn't dared to imagine. "You deserve better than what you've seen at home," she said finally, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. "You deserve a love that shows up, a love that chooses you, a love that doesn't make you sit alone in auditoriums wondering if you matter enough to be worth someone's time." Michael reached across the table and took her hand. "So do you, Mom. So do you." The drive home from the restaurant stretched like an eternity, the silence in Sarah's car thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Before we continue with Sarah's life-changing decision, I hope you're as invested in this story as I am in telling it. If this tale of love, betrayal, and second chances is keeping you on the edge of your seat, please show your support by liking this video and sharing it with someone who believes in the power of honest love. It takes just seconds, but helps these stories reach people who need to hear them. Michael had insisted on taking an Uber back to his apartment, claiming he had friends to celebrate with, but Sarah recognized the gesture for what it was: a kindness, giving her space to process the earthquake he just triggered in her carefully ordered world. Her hands gripped the steering wheel as she navigated the familiar streets of Palo Alto, streets she'd driven for over 20 years while building a life that suddenly felt as fragile as spun glass. Every red light became a moment of reckoning, every turn a reminder that she was driving toward a house that had stopped feeling like home years ago. The Tudor-style house on Elm Street sat dark except for David's home office window, glowing like a beacon of his priorities. Even now, at nearly 10 o'clock on their son's graduation night, he was buried in work that somehow always seemed more urgent than the life happening around him. Sarah sat in the driveway for a long moment staring at that illuminated window and felt the familiar cocktail of resentment and resignation wash over her. When had she become this person? When had she learned to swallow disappointment like bitter medicine and call it marriage? Inside, the house felt cavernous and cold, despite the warmth of the May evening. Sarah kicked off her heels and padded through the living room, past the carefully arranged family photos that told the story of their life in selective snapshots. Michael's first steps, family vacations where David had managed to look up from his phone long enough to smile at the camera, birthday parties and Christmas mornings that she had orchestrated with the precision of a military operation, creating magic through sheer force of will. She paused at a framed photo from Michael's 8th grade graduation. There they were, all three of them, looking like the picture of familial success. But she remembered the moments before that photo was taken, how she had to practically drag him from a conference call, how he'd checked his phone 3 times during the 20-minute ceremony, and how he'd left immediately afterward for an emergency that turned out to be a client dinner he'd forgotten to mention.
"Sarah, that you?" David's voice drifted from his office, distracted and distant, even in greeting. "Yes." She didn't elaborate, didn't add the details he hadn't bothered to ask for. Not, "Yes, I'm home from celebrating our son's incredible achievement." Not, "Yes, I spent the evening explaining your absence to a boy who spent his whole life being disappointed by you." Just, "Yes," because that seemed to be all their communication required anymore. She climbed the stairs to their bedroom, her bedroom, really, since David spent most nights passed out on the couch in his office, and began the ritual of dismantling her public face. The navy dress that had made her feel confident and put together came off first, replaced by an old Stanford sweatshirt that Michael had given her years ago. The carefully applied makeup followed, wiped away with cold cream that left her looking older, more tired, more honest. In the mirror, she met her own eyes and saw her mother looking back at her. Helen Chen had been beautiful once, before years of accommodating her husband's emotional unavailability had worn her down to a shadow of herself. Sarah remembered her mother's perpetual excuse-making, her endless capacity for explaining away disappointment, her tragic belief that love meant accepting whatever scraps of attention were thrown her way. "I'm not her," Sarah whispered to her reflection, but the words felt hollow. Wasn't she? Hadn't she spent 23 years perfecting the same dance of diminished expectations? She thought about Michael's question, "Why do you stay?" The answer felt more complicated in the darkness of her bedroom than it had in the restaurant. She stayed because divorce was scary.
She stayed because she'd built her identity around being David's wife, Michael's mother, the woman who held everything together. She stayed because starting over at 52 felt impossible. She stayed because some stubborn part of her still remembered the man she'd fallen in love with and kept hoping he might resurface. But mostly, if she was being brutally honest, she stayed because she'd forgotten how to want more. The thought hit her like a physical blow. When had she stopped believing she deserved better? When had she accepted that this half-life was the best she could hope for? Her laptop sat on the nightstand, and almost without conscious thought, she opened it and began typing words she'd never allowed herself to think before: divorce lawyer, Palo Alto. The search results bloomed on her screen like forbidden fruit, and she felt a thrill of terror and possibility that made her hands shake. Martindale and Associates, family law specialists, compassionate representation for difficult transitions. She stared at the website for a long time, her finger hovering over the Contact Us button. This felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, and she couldn't tell if the voice in her head was encouraging her to jump or warning her about the fall. A soft knock on the bedroom door made her slam the laptop shut so quickly she nearly dropped it. "Sarah?" David's voice was closer now, and she heard the doorknob turn. "Can I come in?" He appeared in the doorway, rumpled and tired, his tie loosened and his hair disheveled from running his hands through it, a habit that once had seemed endearing, but now just looked like evidence of his stress. He was still handsome at 54, she had to admit. The gray at his temples gave him a distinguished air, and his years of tennis had kept him fit. But looking at him now, Sarah felt nothing but the hollow ache of recognition. This man was a stranger who happened to share her address. "How was the graduation?" he asked, settling onto the edge of the bed with the careful distance they'd perfected over the years. The question was so absurd, so disconnected from reality, that Sarah almost laughed. How was the graduation? How was watching their son achieve something extraordinary while sitting alone in a sea of couples? How was explaining his absence to Michael for the 1,000th time? How was realizing that she'd raised their child essentially as a single parent while playing the role of grateful wife? "It was beautiful," she said finally, because what else was there to say? Michael looked so proud, so happy.
David nodded, but she could see his mind already drifting back to whatever crisis he'd left unresolved in his office. Good, good. I'm sorry I missed it. You know how Hartman gets about deadlines. Hartman. Always Hartman. The senior partner who had become David's excuse for everything. His reason for choosing work over family time and time again. Sarah wondered if David even heard himself anymore, if he realized how often he blamed other people for his own choices. "Do you know what Michael asked me tonight?" The words came out before she could stop them, and she watched David's expression sharpen with something that might have been concern if she squinted hard enough. "What?" "He asked me why I stay." The silence that followed was deafening. David's face cycled through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been hurt if she'd been feeling generous. But Sarah wasn't feeling generous tonight. Tonight, she was feeling raw and honest and tired of protecting everyone else's feelings at the expense of her own. "What did you tell him?" David's voice was carefully neutral, the same tone he used with difficult clients. "I told him it was complicated." "It is complicated." "Is it?" Sarah turned to face him fully, and for the first time in years, she saw him clearly, not as the husband she'd married, not as the father she'd hoped he'd become, but as the man he actually was. "Because it seems pretty simple to me, David. You choose work, every time. Over me, over Michael, over us. And I choose to let you." David's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the skin. "That's not fair, Sarah. You know how demanding my career is. Everything I do for this family." "No." The word came out stronger than she'd expected, and she felt something unlock in her chest. "Everything you do for you. For your ego, for your reputation, for your bank account.
When was the last time you asked me how I was? When was the last time you planned something for us? When was the last time you chose me? I choose you every day, David said, but his voice lacked conviction. I choose to stay married to you. Staying isn't choosing, David. Staying is just inertia. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge, and Sarah watched her husband grapple with a truth he'd spent years avoiding. She'd given him an opening, a chance to fight for them, to prove that their marriage meant more to him than a comfortable arrangement. I don't know what you want me to say, he said finally, and Sarah felt her heart break just a little more. Even now, faced with the possibility of losing her, he couldn't find the words, couldn't access whatever feelings might be buried beneath his professional persona. I want you to say that I miss you. I want you to say that you're sorry. I want you to say that you'll fight for us. I want you to prove that I matter more than a client dinner or a conference call or whatever crisis is happening at Hartman and Associates this week. David looked at her for a long moment, and Sarah saw something flicker across his face. Recognition, maybe, or regret. For just an instant, she thought he might reach for her, might find the words that could bridge the chasm that had opened between them. Instead, he stood up and straightened his tie. I should finish reviewing the Morrison contract. It's due first thing Monday. And just like that, he chose work again. Just like that, he proved her point more eloquently than any argument could have. After he left, Sarah sat in the darkness of their bedroom and felt something fundamental shift inside her. The last thread of hope that had been holding their marriage together finally snapped, and instead of devastation, she felt something unexpected. Relief. She opened her laptop again and clicked Contact Us on the law firm's website before she could lose her nerve. The contact form asked for basic information, name, phone number, brief description of legal needs, and in the text box labeled, "Please describe your situation," she typed, "I need help ending a marriage that ended years ago."
The email was sent with a soft whoosh, and Sarah felt like she'd just stepped off that cliff she'd been standing on. The ground was rushing up to meet her, but for the first time in years, she felt like she was flying. Downstairs, David's office light continued to glow, a beacon of his priorities. But upstairs in their bedroom, Sarah was finally learning to choose herself. She pulled out her phone and sent Michael a text. "Thank you for asking the hard questions. I love you more than words can say." His response came back immediately. "I love you too, Mom. You deserve to be happy." You deserve to be happy. When was the last time someone had told her that? When was the last time she'd believed it? Sarah lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of David moving around downstairs, and for the first time in decades, she began to imagine a different life. A life where she wasn't waiting for someone else to choose her. A life where her own happiness mattered as much as everyone else's comfort. A life where love looked like something more than patient endurance. Tomorrow, Martindale and Associates would call her back. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of untangling 23 years of compromise and accommodation. Tomorrow, she would start learning how to be Sarah Chen again, not just Sarah Martinez, the attorney's wife who had forgotten how to want more. But tonight, for the first time in years, she fell asleep feeling something that might have been peace. The call from Martindale and Associates came at 9:17 on Monday morning, while Sarah was standing in her kitchen pretending to read the newspaper and actually rehearsing conversations she might never have the courage to begin. David had left for work at his usual time, 6:45 a.m. sharp, with nothing more than a distracted kiss on her forehead and a muttered reminder about the Henderson dinner party on Friday. "Mrs. Martinez, this is Jennifer Martindale. I received your inquiry over the weekend." "Yes," Sarah managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for calling back so quickly. I'd like to schedule a consultation if you're ready to take that step.
Sometimes it helps just to understand your options, even if you're not sure you want to pursue them yet. Options. Such a simple word, but it felt revolutionary. For so long, Sarah's life had felt like a series of inevitabilities. Stay married, keep quiet, make excuses, endure. The idea that she might actually have choices felt both terrifying and intoxicating. "When could we meet?" she heard herself asking. "I have an opening this afternoon at 2 o'clock, if that works for you." This afternoon. In 5 hours, she could be sitting across from a lawyer discussing the dissolution of her marriage like it was a business transaction. The thought made her stomach lurch with anxiety and something that might have been excitement. "I'll be there." After hanging up, Sarah stood in her pristine kitchen, the kitchen she'd renovated 3 years ago to David's exact specifications, with granite countertops he'd chosen and stainless steel appliances he insisted they needed, and felt like a stranger in her own life. Every surface gleamed with the effort she'd poured into making this house perfect, into making their life look successful from the outside. But perfection, she was beginning to realize, wasn't the same as happiness. Her phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "How are you feeling today, Mom? Yesterday was a lot." Yesterday was a lot. Such a gentle way of acknowledging that her son had watched her world shift on its axis over dinner. She typed back, "Taking things one day at a time. How are you settling in?" "Good. Unpacking boxes and trying to figure out how to be an adult." "Coffee later this week?" "I'd love that. Love you, Mom."
Love you too. The exchange felt like a lifeline, a reminder that whatever happened with David, she wasn't alone. Michael might be starting his own life, but he would always be her son, and their bond had been forged in the fires of all those moments when it was just the two of them against the world. The morning passed in a haze of nervous energy. Sarah found herself moving through the house like a detective, cataloging the evidence of her marriage's decline. The separate bedrooms they'd been sleeping in for the past 2 years, the family photos that stopped including all 3 of them around the time Michael turned 16, the dining room table they hadn't eaten at together in months because David was always working through dinner. At 1:30, she drove to downtown Palo Alto with the careful precision of someone heading to her own execution. The law offices of Martindale and Associates occupied the 3rd floor of a sleek building on University Avenue, and Sarah spent 10 minutes in the parking garage trying to work up the courage to get out of her car. Jennifer Martindale turned out to be a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and silver-streaked brown hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her office was decorated with family photos and inspirational quotes, but also with certificates and awards that spoke to serious legal credentials. This wasn't someone who would coddle Sarah through her crisis. This was someone who would help her navigate it with competence and compassion. "Tell me about your marriage," Jennifer said, after they'd settled in with coffee and the initial paperwork. "Where to begin? With the early days when David had been attentive and ambitious in equal measure? With the gradual erosion of intimacy as his career consumed more and more of his energy? With the moment she realized she was essentially a single parent married to a stranger?" "We've been married for 23 years, Sarah began. "Our son just graduated from Stanford, and I think we've been strangers for most of it." The words tumbled out then. 23 years of accumulated disappointment and diminished expectations. She told Jennifer about the missed events, the forgotten anniversaries, the way David's phone always seemed more important than her voice. She talked about feeling invisible in her own marriage, about the way she'd learned to shrink her needs to fit around his schedule. "What changed?" Jennifer asked gently. "What made you reach out now?" "My son asked me why I stay, and I realized I didn't have a good answer. I realized I've been teaching him that love looks like accepting whatever scraps someone throws your way." Jennifer nodded with the understanding of someone who'd heard variations of this story countless times.
What outcome are you hoping for? Are you looking to save your marriage, or are you ready to end it? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Was she ready? Could anyone ever really be ready to blow up their entire life? I want him to fight for us, Sarah admitted. I want him to realize what he's about to lose and choose differently, but I don't think he will. And if he doesn't, then I need to choose myself. They spent the next hour discussing practical matters: assets, custody, though Michael was an adult now, spousal support, the timeline for different types of divorce proceedings. Jennifer explained California's no-fault divorce laws, the process of property division, the various ways a marriage could be legally dissolved. It was clinical and businesslike, and yet Sarah felt more empowered than she had in years. These weren't just abstract concepts anymore. They were real possibilities, actual paths she could take toward a different future.
"I'd like you to think carefully about what you want to try before filing papers," Jennifer said as they concluded. "Sometimes a separation can be a wake-up call. Sometimes couples counseling can help bridge the gap. But sometimes the kindest thing you can do for everyone involved is to admit that the marriage has run its course." Driving home, Sarah felt like she was floating outside her own body, watching a woman navigate traffic while her life pivoted around her. The consultation had made everything feel more real and more terrifying. There was no going back to ignorant acceptance now. She'd opened a door that couldn't be closed again. The house was still empty when she arrived, and she found herself walking through it with new eyes. What would she take if she left? What mattered to her versus what mattered to the life she'd built with David? The antique dining room set his mother had insisted they inherit? The oil painting they'd bought on their honeymoon in Italy when they still believed they were building something beautiful together? Her phone rang at 4:30, David's name flashing on the screen. "I'm going to be late tonight," he said without preamble. "The Morrison deal is falling apart and we need to restructure the entire contract." "Of course you are," Sarah said, and something in her tone must have registered because David paused. "Is everything okay?" The question was almost funny. When was the last time everything had been okay? When was the last time he'd cared enough to really listen to the answer? "I saw a lawyer today," she said quietly. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Sarah wondered if the call had dropped. Then David's voice came back, sharp and startled. What kind of lawyer? "A divorce lawyer." Another silence, this one loaded with something that might have been panic. Sarah could almost hear him calculating, trying to figure out if this was a threat or a warning or a done deal. "Sarah, we need to talk about this. When I get home tonight." "When will that be, David? 9, 10, 11? Because I've been trying to talk to you for years, and there's always something more important." "This is important. This is our marriage." She hung up before he could respond, and for the first time since Michael's graduation, she felt like she'd spoken her truth without apology or explanation. David came home at 6:15, a record for him in recent memory, and found Sarah in the living room reading a book, not pretending to read while waiting for him, not anxiously checking the clock and warming his dinner for the third time, actually reading, genuinely absorbed in a story that had nothing to do with him. "We need to talk," he said, loosening his tie with the jerky movements of a man who'd been rehearsing a speech in traffic. "Now we need to talk," Sarah said, without looking up from her book. "Interesting." "Don't be sarcastic, Sarah. This is serious." She marked her place and set the book aside, finally meeting his eyes. He looked genuinely shaken, she realized. For the first time in years, he had her complete attention. "You're right. This is serious. Our son graduated from Stanford on Saturday, summa cum laude, in case you were wondering, and you chose a work emergency over being there, again, just like you chose work over his high school graduation, over his soccer championships, over every milestone that mattered to him.
I provide for this family. You provide money for this family, but you haven't provided presence or attention or love for years. You've been a ghost in our lives, David. A very expensive ghost who pays the mortgage and occasionally shows up for family photos. David sat down heavily in his leather chair. His chair, she noticed, not theirs, and ran his hands through his hair. I know I've been working a lot lately, but this is a crucial time in my career. The partnership track at Hartman.
There's always a crucial time, Sarah said. There's always a partnership track or a big case or a client emergency. There's always something more important than us. That's not true, isn't it? Sarah stood up and walked to the mantelpiece, where their wedding photo sat among an array of family pictures. She picked it up and studied the young couple staring back at her, hopeful, in love, convinced they were building something that would last forever. When was the last time we had dinner together? When was the last time you asked me about my day and actually listened to the answer? When was the last time we made love? The last question hung in the air like an accusation, and Sarah watched David's face flush with something that might have been embarrassment or anger or both. Sex isn't everything in a marriage, he said defensively. You're right, it's not. But attention is, presence is, choosing each other is. And you stopped choosing us a long time ago. So you're just going to throw away 23 years? The question revealed everything about how he saw their marriage, as an investment too valuable to lose rather than a relationship worth fighting for. I'm not throwing anything away, Sarah said quietly. I'm finally admitting what we both know, but have been too cowardly to say. This marriage has been over for years. We've just been going through the motions. David stood up abruptly and began pacing, his corporate problem-solving instincts kicking in. We can fix this. We can go to counseling. I can cut back on my hours. Can you? Sarah asked. Really? Because you've made that promise before, David. Remember when Michael was in Little League? Remember when I had my cancer scare 5 years ago? Remember our 15th anniversary when you swore things would be different? She watched the memories flicker across his face, watched him realize that this wasn't their first conversation about his priorities. It was just the first time she'd stopped accepting his promises as enough. I love you, he said desperately, and Sarah felt her heart break a little because she could hear that he meant it in whatever limited way he understood love. I know you do, she said gently, but you love your career more. You love the validation of being important at work more than you love the messy, daily work of being important at home. And I can't compete with that anymore. Don't I get a chance to try? Don't I get a chance to show you that I can change? The question pierced through her anger and hit something softer underneath. This was the man she'd fallen in love with, the one who showed up occasionally to remind her why she'd stayed so long. But 23 years had taught her the difference between wanting to change and actually being capable of it. How many chances do you need, David? How many times do I have to explain what I need before you believe me? How many years am I supposed to wait for you to decide that I'm worth your time and attention? You didn't know it was this bad, he said, and the helplessness in his voice was almost enough to make her reconsider. Almost. You didn't know because you didn't ask. You didn't know because you weren't paying attention. I've been drowning right next to you for years, and you never noticed because you were too busy staring at your phone. The fight went on for hours, cycling through anger and accusation, brief moments of tenderness and back to anger again. David made promises he'd made before and broken before. Sarah explained needs she'd explained countless times. They rehashed old grievances and circled around the fundamental truth that had brought them to this moment. They had become incompatible people who happened to share a history. Finally, exhausted and emotionally drained, David played his last card.
What about Michael? Have you thought about what this will do to him? It was the wrong thing to say. Sarah felt something cold and hard settle in her chest, the final door slamming shut on whatever doubt she might have been harboring. What about Michael? She said, her voice deadly quiet. You mean the son whose graduation you missed? The son you've disappointed so many times that he's learned not to expect anything from you? The son who asked me why I stay in a marriage that models all the wrong things about love? He said that? He said that. And he was right to say it. Because what kind of love am I teaching him to accept, David?
What kind of partnership am I showing him to expect? That love means waiting endlessly for someone to choose you? That marriage means accommodating someone else's neglect? David sank back into his chair, and for the first time, Sarah saw him clearly understand the scope of what he'd lost. Not just her, but Michael's respect, years of memories he'd traded for billable hours, a family he'd taken for granted until it was too late to save. "I'll fight the divorce," he said finally. "I won't make it easy." Sarah looked at this man she'd once loved with such certainty and felt nothing but pity. Even now, faced with losing everything, he was thinking like a lawyer instead of a husband. "Go ahead, fight it. Make it ugly and expensive and painful. But ask yourself this, what exactly are you fighting for? A wife who's stopped loving you? A son who's learned not to depend on you? A marriage that exists only on paper?" She stood up and walked toward the stairs, then turned back for one last look at the man who had been her husband for 23 years. "I'm sleeping in the guest room tonight, and tomorrow I'm calling Jennifer back to start the paperwork. You can choose to make this easy or hard, David, but you can't choose to make it not happen. I'm done." As she climbed the stairs, she heard David's phone ring. She knew without looking that he would answer it, that whatever crisis was calling would seem more manageable than the one sitting in his living room. Some patterns were too ingrained to break, even in the face of losing everything. In the guest room, Sarah lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of David on a conference call downstairs. Even at the end of their marriage, work came first. Even when his world was falling apart, he chose the comfort of being needed professionally over the discomfort of fighting for his family. She thought about Michael, probably out with friends celebrating his graduation, and the bright future stretching ahead of him. She thought about the conversation they'd have about the divorce, about how she'd explain that sometimes loving someone meant accepting that you weren't right for each other. She thought about the example she was finally setting for him, that love shouldn't require you to disappear, that marriage should be a choice you make every day, not an obligation you endure. For the first time since Saturday night, Sarah fell asleep feeling like she was moving towards something instead of just enduring it. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be pretty, but it would be honest. And after 23 years of beautiful lies, honesty felt like a gift she was finally ready to give herself. The papers arrived on a Thursday morning in early June, delivered by a process server who looked apologetic as he handed them to David at the front door. Sarah watched from the kitchen window as her husband, of 23 years, stood in his driveway, still in his expensive suit and silk tie, staring at the divorce petition like it was written in a foreign language. She had expected to feel triumphant in this moment, or at least relieved. Instead, she felt hollow, like she was watching the final scene of a tragedy she'd been forced to star in. There was no victory in watching someone's world crumble, even when that someone had spent years taking yours for granted. David came through the front door, moving like a sleepwalker, the papers clutched in his white-knuckled grip. His usually perfect hair was disheveled from running his hands through it, and his face had the gray pallor of a man who'd just received news of his own mortality. "Sarah?" His voice cracked on her name, and she turned from the coffee maker where she'd been hiding, trying to look busy with anything other than watching her husband's heart break in real time.
"I heard the doorbell," she said quietly. "I assumed that's what it was." "You really did it." He held up the papers like evidence of her betrayal. "You actually filed for divorce." The word hung between them like a knife, sharp and final. There was no taking it back now. No pretending this was just another fight they'd eventually forget. The legal machinery had been set in motion, and their marriage was officially dying. "What did you expect, David? I told you I was going to do this. I hoped you'd change your mind. I thought maybe if I tried harder." "You haven't tried harder," Sarah interrupted, and her voice was gentler than she'd intended. "You answered 3 work calls during our fight on Monday night. You left for the office at 6:30 a.m. Tuesday morning and didn't come home until I was asleep. Yesterday you missed dinner because of an emergency at work. When exactly did you try harder?" David's face crumpled. And for a moment, he looked like the young man she'd married, vulnerable and lost and desperately seeking something he didn't know how to name. It would have been easier if he'd gotten angry, if he'd stormed out or launched into another speech about everything he'd provided for their family. Anger she could handle. This raw, naked pain was harder to witness. "I don't know how to be different," he admitted, sinking onto one of the kitchen stools. "I don't know how to want anything other than success. I don't know how to turn off the voice in my head that says nothing I do is ever enough." It was perhaps the most honest thing he'd said to her in years, and Sarah felt something soften in her chest despite everything. This was the man she'd glimpsed occasionally over the decades, the one buried beneath the ambition and the need to prove himself worthy of his father's law firm legacy. "I know that," she said simply, "and I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry your father made you feel like love was something you had to earn through achievement. I'm sorry the law firm made you believe your worth was measured in billable hours. But I can't fix that for you, David. I can't love you enough to heal whatever's broken inside you that makes you choose work over family every single time. You're giving up on us." "I gave up on us years ago," Sarah said, and watched him flinch at the truth. "I just finally stopped pretending I hadn't." They stood in the kitchen they'd renovated together, surrounded by the trappings of their successful life, and Sarah realized this might be the first completely honest conversation they'd had in a decade. It was fitting that it was also probably their last. "What happens now?" David asked, and she could hear the lawyer in him trying to regain control through logistics and procedure. "Now we divide 23 years into assets and liabilities. Now we figure out who gets the house and who gets the investment portfolio. Now we learn how to be strangers again." "And Michael?" "Michael is an adult. He'll adjust. He's actually relieved, if you want to know the truth. He said he's tired of watching me disappear a little more each year." The words hit David like a physical blow, and Sarah watched him absorb the reality that his son, their son, had been watching their marriage deteriorate with the clear eyes of someone who'd grown up in its wreckage. "I should call him," David said suddenly. "I should explain." "Explain what? That you're sorry you missed his graduation? That you're sorry you chose work over being present for most of his childhood? That you're sorry you modeled a version of marriage that made him question whether love actually exists?" Each word was a scalpel, precise and cutting, and Sarah watched David bleed from the truth of them. She hadn't meant to be cruel, but 23 years of accumulated hurt had to go somewhere, and apparently today was the day it all came pouring out. "I love him," David whispered. "I love both of you."
"I know you do. But love isn't just a feeling, David. Love is a choice you make every day. Love is showing up. Love is choosing your family over your ego. Love is being present for the moments that matter. And you stopped choosing us a long time ago." David buried his face in his hands, and Sarah heard a sound she hadn't heard in years, her husband crying. Not the careful, controlled emotion he allowed himself during particularly moving movies, but real, ugly sobbing that shook his shoulders and made his breathing ragged. She wanted to comfort him. Despite everything, her first instinct was still to ease his pain, to make this easier for him. But she forced herself to stay on the other side of the kitchen, to let him feel the full weight of what he'd lost without rushing in to cushion the blow. "There's something else," she said quietly, when his sobs had subsided to quiet weeping. "Something I need to tell you." David looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes, and Sarah saw fear flicker across his features. What else could there be? What other revelation could possibly make this moment worse? "I've been keeping a secret," she continued, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. "For 23 years, I've been keeping a secret that I thought would protect us. But I realize now that secrets don't protect anyone. They just delay the inevitable." "Sarah, what are you talking about?" She walked to the kitchen drawer where she kept important papers, insurance documents, warranties, the marriage certificate she'd probably never look at again. Beneath it all was a manila envelope she'd hidden there 2 decades ago. yellowed with age and sealed with the weight of everything she'd never said. Her hands trembled as she pulled it out, and for a moment she almost lost her nerve. This secret had shaped their entire marriage, influenced every choice she'd made, colored every moment of disappointment she had endured. Once she spoke it aloud, there would be no taking it back. "Do you remember when we were trying to get pregnant with Michael? How it took us almost 3 years? How we went to specialists and did all those tests?" David nodded slowly, confusion creasing his brow. "The doctor said there were some issues, but nothing that couldn't be overcome with the right treatment." "The doctor lied," Sarah said simply. "Not to you, to me. He told me privately that the problem wasn't with both of us. It was with you. Your sperm count was so low that natural conception was virtually impossible. He said our chances were less than 5% without intervention." The color drained from David's face as he processed what she was telling him. "But Michael is a miracle," Sarah finished. "A genuine, against all odds, miracle. But he's not yours, David. Not biologically." The words fell into the kitchen like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock and disbelief across David's features. Sarah watched him try to make sense of what she had said, watched him mentally calculate dates and revisit memories with this new, devastating information. "That's impossible," he said finally. "You would have told me. You wouldn't have—" "I had an affair," Sarah said, cutting through his denial with surgical precision. "One night, 3 months before we found out I was pregnant. I was so tired of failing, so desperate to give you the family you wanted, so convinced that our marriage wouldn't survive if we couldn't have children." David stared at her like she'd suddenly started speaking in tongues. "With who?" "Do you remember Dr. James Chen from the fertility clinic, the reproductive endocrinologist who oversaw our case?" Understanding dawned on David's face like a horrific sunrise. Your doctor?" "He wasn't my doctor yet. We met at a medical conference. I was there representing the foundation. He was presenting research on fertility treatments. We had dinner. We talked about our work, about the couples who came to him desperate for children they might never have."
Sarah could see David doing the math, remembering the timeline, realizing that the night she'd claimed to be at a foundation fundraiser had actually been the night that created their son. "It was one night," she continued, her voice steady despite the chaos she was unleashing. "One night of loneliness and desperation and too much wine and the crazy idea that maybe if I could just get pregnant somehow, it would save us, save our marriage, give you the air you needed to feel like your life meant something." "Jesus Christ, Sarah." David's voice was barely a whisper. "Jesus Christ." "I found out 2 weeks later. When I called to tell him, he told me he'd lied to you about the test results. He said he'd seen too many marriages destroyed by male infertility diagnoses, too many men who couldn't handle the blow to their masculinity. He thought if he made it seem like the problem was mutual, it would be easier for you to accept. So you let me believe Michael was mine." "Michael is yours," Sarah said fiercely. "In every way that matters, he is completely, totally yours. You raised him. You loved him. You're his father in every meaningful sense of the word. But not biologically." "No, not biologically." David stood up abruptly and began pacing the kitchen like a caged animal, his mind clearly reeling with the implications of what she'd revealed. 23 years of fatherhood recontextualized in an instant. Every moment of pride, every shared accomplishment, every time someone had commented on how much Michael looked like him, all of it built on a lie. "Why are you telling me this now?" he demanded. "Why, after all these years, are you destroying the one thing I thought I could count on?" "Because you deserve to know the truth. Because Michael deserves to know the truth. Because I'm tired of living with this secret, tired of letting it poison everything good between us."
It doesn't poison anything. It destroys everything. Everything I thought I knew about my life, about my son, about... His voice cracked, and he stopped pacing, gripping the edge of the counter like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Does it know that Michael's DNA came from someone else change how you feel about him? Does it change the way he looked at you when he took his first steps? Does it change the pride in his eyes when he talks about his father? Does it change the fact that you're the man he calls when he needs advice or comfort or just someone to listen? Yes, it changes everything. It means I've been living a lie for 23 years. It means every moment I thought was real was built on deception. The love was real, Sarah said quietly. Your love for Michael, his love for you, that was never a lie. That was never anything but completely, authentically real. You don't get to decide that, David said, raw with pain. You don't get to make that choice for me. You should have told me from the beginning. You should have let me decide whether I could handle the truth. Would you have? Would you have raised Michael as your own if you'd known from the start that he wasn't biologically yours? Would you have been the father he needed, or would you have spent every day looking at him and seeing someone else's child? The question hung in the air between them, and Sarah watched David grapple with an honest answer. She knew him well enough to see the truth flickering across his face. He wasn't sure. The man who measured everything by achievement and success and genetic legacy wasn't certain he could love a child who didn't carry his DNA. I don't know, he admitted. And the honesty of it was devastating.
I couldn't risk it, Sarah said. I couldn't risk that you'd look at him differently, treat him differently, love him less. He deserved better than that. He deserved a father who saw him as a miracle instead of a reminder of his own limitations. So you decided for me. You decided I wasn't strong enough to handle the truth? I decided you were strong enough to be his father. And I was right, David. Look at the man he's become. Look at how much he loves you, how proud he is to be your son. I gave you both the gift of that relationship by not burdening it with biology. David was quiet for a long time, staring out the kitchen window at the backyard where he'd taught Michael to throw a baseball, where they'd built a treehouse together during one of David's rare weekend projects, where they'd had their last real conversation before Michael left for college. Does he know? David asked finally. No, but I think he should. I think he has a right to know his medical history, to understand where he came from. And I think you both deserve a relationship built on truth instead of carefully maintained fiction. He'll hate me, David said, and Sarah heard the fear beneath the words. Why would he hate you? Because I wasn't enough. Because his real father is some brilliant doctor and I'm just a workaholic lawyer who missed his graduation. The pain in his voice was so raw, so vulnerable that Sarah felt her own eyes fill with tears. This was the heart of it, she realized. This was the insecurity that had driven David to work himself into the ground for 23 years. The fear that he wasn't enough, that he didn't deserve the good things in his life, that love was something he had to earn through achievement, rather than something he was worthy of simply by existing. David, she said gently, moving closer to him, for the first time since this conversation began, Michael doesn't love you because you're successful or because you share his DNA. He loves you because you're his father, because you taught him to ride a bike and helped him with his math homework and showed up to his soccer games even when you were exhausted from work. He loves you because you're the man who raised him, not the man who donated genetic material. But I wasn't enough, David repeated. I wasn't a good enough husband to keep you faithful. I wasn't a good enough father to prioritize him over work. I wasn't enough. You're right, Sarah said, and watched him recoil as if she'd slapped him. You weren't enough as a husband. You chose work over our marriage so consistently that I felt invisible in my own life. You missed moments that mattered, prioritized clients over family, and took my presence for granted until I was finally ready to leave. David's face crumpled, but Sarah wasn't finished. But as a father, you were everything he needed you to be.
You were patient when he struggled with reading. You were proud when he excelled at science. You were present for the moments that mattered most, even if you missed some of the smaller ones. You gave him confidence and values and a sense of who he could become. Biology didn't do that, David. Love did that. Your love. They stood in their kitchen, surrounded by the debris of their marriage, and Sarah watched her husband absorb the truth of what she'd revealed. Not just the secret about Michael's paternity, but the deeper truth about love and family and what really mattered. I don't know how to process this. I don't know how to reconcile 23 years of believing one thing and suddenly learning something completely different. You don't have to process it alone, Sarah said gently. We can tell Michael together. We can help him understand that families aren't just about biology. They're about choice and commitment and love. We can show him that you chose to be his father every day for 23 years, and that's what makes him your real dad.
And us? David asked. What about us? Sarah looked at this man she'd loved and lied to and protected and resented and felt something shift in her chest. The secret that had lived between them for so long was finally gone, and without it, she could see him clearly for the first time in years. I don't know, she said honestly. I don't know if we can come back from 23 years of emotional distance. I don't know if you can change the patterns that drove us apart. I don't know if I can trust you to choose us over work when the next crisis comes along. But maybe we could try. The hope in his voice was fragile and tentative, like a child asking for something he knew he probably couldn't have. Maybe, Sarah said, but not because we're afraid of being alone. Not because divorce is scary or expensive or complicated. Only if we both genuinely believe we can build something better than what we had. David nodded, tears still streaming down his face, and Sarah realized this was the most honest conversation they'd had in their entire marriage. It had taken the threat of divorce and the revelation of a 23-year-old secret to strip away all the pretense and get to the truth of who they were and what they needed from each other. The road ahead was uncertain and probably painful. There would be conversations with Michael that would reshape their family forever. There would be decisions about their marriage that couldn't be undone. There would be consequences for choices made decades ago finally coming home to roost. But for the first time in years, Sarah felt like they were finally dealing with reality instead of managing carefully constructed illusions. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something real. They called Michael together that evening, sitting side by side on the living room couch for the first time in months. Sarah held the phone between them on speaker, her hand trembling slightly as she dialed their son's number. 23 years of careful protection were about to come undone in a single conversation, and she wasn't sure any of them were ready for what came next. "Hey, Mom, Dad?" Michael's voice came through clear and surprised. It was rare for both parents to call together, rarer still for David to be home early enough to participate in family phone calls. "Hi, sweetheart," Sarah said, glancing at David, who was staring at the phone like it might explode. "We wanted to talk to you about something important. Are you somewhere private?" "Yeah, I'm at my apartment. Is everything okay? You both sound weird." Sarah felt David reach for her hand, his fingers cold and shaking against hers. In the past, she would have been the one to carry this conversation, to cushion the blow and manage everyone's emotions. But this secret belonged to both of them now, and David needed to find his own words. "Michael," David's voice was rough, barely above a whisper. "There's something we need to tell you. Something about our family. About you." "Okay." Michael's tone shifted, becoming more serious. "What is it?" Sarah squeezed David's hand, giving him the strength to continue. This was his moment to choose, to be the father Michael needed him to be. Biology be damned. "I found out today that I'm not your biological father," David said, and Sarah heard his voice crack on the words. "Your mother, there was someone else, before you were born." The silence that followed stretched so long that Sarah wondered if the call had dropped. She could picture Michael on the other end, processing information that would reframe his entire understanding of his identity, his family, his place in the world. "Michael," she said gently, "are you there?" "I'm here." His voice sounded different, older somehow, more careful. "I'm just trying to understand. Are you saying Mom had an affair?"
Yes, Sarah said, taking over when David seemed unable to continue. 23 years ago, when we were having trouble getting pregnant, I made a choice that I thought would give us the family we desperately wanted. Who is he? My biological father. His name is Dr. James Chen. He was a fertility specialist. It was one night, Michael, one night, when I was desperate and lonely and convinced that giving your father a child would save our marriage.
Another long pause. Sarah found herself holding her breath, waiting for anger or accusations or demands for explanations. Instead, when Michael spoke again, his voice was thoughtful. "Does this change anything?" he asked. "I mean, between us, between Dad and me." David's head shot up, his eyes wide with surprise at the question. Sarah watched her husband struggle to find words for emotions he'd never had to navigate before. "Does it change anything for you?" David asked carefully. "Finding out that we don't share DNA?" "No," Michael said without hesitation, and Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes at the certainty in his voice. "You're my dad. You taught me how to throw a curveball and helped me with calculus and came to my soccer games, even when you were dead tired. You raised me. That's what makes you my father." David broke then, sobbing with relief and gratitude and 23 years of love that had never needed biology to validate it. Sarah rubbed his back as he wept, watching her husband finally understand what she'd tried to tell him earlier, that fatherhood was about so much more than genetic contribution. "But I want to know about him," Michael continued, "about Dr. Chen, medical history, personality traits, that kind of thing. Not because I need another father, but because it's part of my story." "Of course," Sarah said. "I can tell you what I remember, and we can reach out to him if you'd like. He's probably retired by now, but I'm sure he'd be willing to answer questions." "What about you two?" Michael asked. "How are you handling this? And don't say you're fine. I can hear it in both your voices that this is huge." Sarah looked at David, who was wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. They hadn't talked about what this revelation meant for their marriage, hadn't addressed whether the divorce papers sitting on the kitchen counter were still the inevitable next step. "We're figuring it out," David said, finding his voice again. "This changes things. Not between you and me, that will never change. But between your mother and me, we have a lot to work through. Are you getting divorced?" The direct question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah realized that Michael had probably seen this coming long before either of his parents had been willing to admit it. Children always knew. They always saw the cracks in the foundation, even when the adults were pretending everything was solid. "We don't know yet," Sarah answered honestly. "We've hurt each other in ways that can't be undone. Your father has spent years choosing work over family, and I've spent years keeping secrets and making decisions I should have made together. We both have to decide if we can forgive those things and build something better. Can I tell you something? And please don't get defensive because I love you both, but I need to say this." "Anything," David said. "I've been watching you two my whole life, and I've never seen you really choose each other. Not consistently. Dad, you choose work. Every time. Even when Mom needed you, even when I needed you, even when we were both right there asking for your attention. And Mom, you choose to enable that. You make excuses for him. You cover for his absences. You shrink yourself smaller and smaller so he doesn't have to change." The words hit like arrows, precise and devastating. Sarah felt her chest tighten with the accuracy of her son's observations. "I've been terrified that I'll end up in a marriage like yours, where love looks like accommodation and disappointment, and two people who share a house but not a life. Is that what you want to model for me? Is that what love is supposed to look like?" "No, God, no. Michael, that's not love. That's what happens when people stop choosing each other every day." "Then why did you do it? Why did you both settle for so much less than you deserved?" It was the same question Michael had asked Sarah at his graduation dinner, but now it carried the weight of this new revelation, the understanding that their family had been built on secrets and compromise and fear. "Because I was scared," Sarah admitted.
Scared of being alone? Scared of disrupting your life? Scared of admitting that I'd made choices that couldn't be undone? And because somewhere along the way, I forgot that I deserved better. And I was scared too, David added, his voice thick with emotion. Scared that if I slowed down, if I stopped achieving, if I wasn't constantly proving my worth, everyone would realize I wasn't good enough, that you weren't really my son, that your mother didn't really love me, that everything good in my life was just borrowed.
But it was never borrowed, Michael said gently. My love for you isn't conditional on shared genetics. Mom's love for you wasn't conditional on career success. We loved you because of who you are, not what you accomplished. Sarah watched David absorb these words, watched him try to reconcile them with a lifetime of believing his worth was tied to his achievements. This was the work of therapy and soul-searching, and possibly years of unlearning patterns that had been carved into his psyche since childhood. I want to be better, David said finally. I want to learn how to choose you both every day, not just when it's convenient or easy. I want to learn what love actually looks like when it's not filtered through fear and insecurity. And I want to learn how to ask for what I need instead of just accepting what I'm given, Sarah added. I want to model real partnership for you, not just survival. So, what does that mean practically? Michael asked gently. Are you going to couples therapy? Are you calling off the divorce? Are you starting over? Sarah and David looked at each other across the couch, and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen in years. Hope. Not the desperate hope of someone trying to avoid consequences, but the steady hope of someone willing to do the work required for real change. I think, David said slowly, we need to start with honesty. Complete, uncomfortable, no-holds-barred honesty about what we need from each other and what we're willing to give. No more secrets, no more assumptions, no more accepting less than we deserve. And therapy, Sarah added. Both couples therapy and individual therapy, because we both have work to do on ourselves before we can build something healthy together. And time, David said. I need to prove to both of you that I can change, that I can choose family over career when it matters, that I can be present and engaged and worthy of the love you've both shown me. How long? Sarah asked. How long do we try before we admit it's not working? I don't know, David said honestly, but I know I want to try. Really try. Not just promise to try and then fall back into old patterns when things get stressful. They talked for another hour, the three of them working through logistics and emotions and the practical realities of rebuilding trust. Michael asked more questions about Dr. Chen, about the fertility treatments, about the choices Sarah had made 23 years ago. David talked about his father's impossible standards and the pressure he had felt to prove himself worthy of the family law firm. Sarah admitted to her own patterns of accommodation and self-sacrifice that had started long before she had met David. When they finally hung up, Sarah and David sat in their living room surrounded by the ghosts of 23 years of marriage, and for the first time in forever, the silence between them felt comfortable rather than charged with unspoken resentment. I called in sick tomorrow, David said suddenly. You never call in sick. I know, but I want to spend the day looking for a therapist. For both of us. I want to figure out how to be the husband you deserve and the father Michael deserves, and I can't do that if I'm sitting in my office billing hours. Sarah stared at him, trying to process this small but seismic shift. David choosing personal healing over professional obligations felt like watching the sun rise in the west. What about the Morrison contract? What about Hartman's deadline? Fuck the Morrison contract, David said, and Sarah's eyes widened at the vehemence in his voice. Fuck Hartman's deadline. Fuck the partnership track and the billable hour requirements and all the other things I've used as excuses to avoid dealing with my actual life. He stood up and walked to his briefcase, pulling out his phone and laptop and setting them deliberately on the coffee table. I'm going to call Hartman first thing in the morning and tell him I need a leave of absence, unpaid if necessary. I'm going to tell him that I've spent 23 years prioritizing his needs over my family's needs, and that stops now. David, you could lose your partnership.
Good, he said simply. Maybe it's time to find out who I am when I'm not defined by my job title. Maybe it's time to remember what I actually wanted to be when I grew up,
before my father convinced me that worth was measured in profit margins. Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a crack in the walls she'd built around her heart. This wasn't the David she'd married, the ambitious young lawyer desperate to prove himself. This wasn't the David she'd been living with, either, the workaholic who'd forgotten how to exist outside his office. This was someone new, or maybe someone very old who'd been buried under decades of expectations and fear. "I filed the divorce papers," she said quietly. "They're not just going away because we had one honest conversation." "I know. And maybe that's where this ends. Maybe we've hurt each other too much to come back from it. But I want to try, Sarah. I want to see if we can build something real from the ashes of what we had." "It won't be easy. There will be days when you resent giving up the partnership, when the old patterns feel easier than doing this work." "I know. There will be days when I don't trust your promises, when I'm waiting for you to choose work over us again." "I know. And there will probably be days when we both wonder if we're just prolonging the inevitable, if some things are too broken to be fixed." David moved closer to her on the couch, not touching, but near enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could smell the cologne she'd given him for Christmas 3 years ago. "Maybe," he said, "but for the first time in years, I want to find out. I want to discover who we could be if we both showed up for this marriage instead of just enduring it." Sarah looked at this man she'd loved and resented and protected and deceived and felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Curiosity. Not about whether they could save their marriage, that remained to be seen, but about who they might become if they both committed to the hard work of choosing each other every day. "Okay, let's try." It wasn't a guarantee. It wasn't even a promise. It was just an agreement to see what happened when two people decided to fight for their relationship instead of just surviving it. Outside, the California evening was settling into darkness, but inside their living room, something that felt like possibility was beginning to bloom. They had a long road ahead. Therapy sessions and difficult conversations and the daily work of rebuilding trust. They had to tell Michael about their decision to try again, had to figure out how to contact Dr. Chen, had to learn how to be honest with each other after decades of careful emotional management. But for the first time in years, Sarah felt like they were moving towards something instead of just moving away from pain. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start with. The divorce papers sat on the kitchen counter, forgotten for the moment. Tomorrow, they would deal with lawyers and logistics and the practical realities of undoing legal proceedings. Tomorrow, David would make the hardest phone call of his career. Tomorrow, they would begin the work of learning how to love each other without fear or reservation or the weight of secrets. But tonight, they sat together on their couch and talked until dawn about the people they used to be, the people they'd become, and the people they still hoped they could be. It felt like the beginning of something, not the restoration of their old marriage, but the birth of something entirely new. Something that looked like what love was supposed to look like, when two people finally learned how to choose each other. 18 months later. The coffee shop on University Avenue bustled with the familiar energy of a Friday afternoon in Palo Alto. Sarah sat at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a ceramic mug that had grown cool while she'd been lost in thought, watching the stream of people hurrying past the windows. Stanford students with backpacks and laptops, tech workers in expensive casual wear, families with strollers navigating the crowded sidewalks, all of them living their lives with the purposeful momentum of people who knew where they were going. She used to be one of them, she thought, used to move through the world with that same sense of certainty, that conviction that if she just managed everything perfectly enough, life would unfold according to plan. Now she knew better. Now she understood that the most important things, love, family, happiness, couldn't be managed into existence. They had to be chosen, day after day, even when it was difficult. Sorry I'm late. David's voice cut through her reverie, and she looked up to see her husband sliding into the chair across from her. His hair was more silver now, and he'd traded his expensive suits for jeans and button-down shirts that made him look younger, more relaxed. The perpetual tension that had lived in his shoulders for decades had finally begun to ease. "You're not late," Sarah said, glancing at her phone. "I was early. Old habits." David smiled, the easy smile she'd fallen in love with 30 years ago and had thought she'd lost forever somewhere in the maze of their marriage. "How did the appointment go?" Sarah had just come from her monthly session with Dr. Patricia Wong, the therapist she'd been seeing individually for over a year now. It was still strange, talking to a stranger about her deepest fears and disappointments, but it had been necessary. She had had to learn how to want things for herself again, how to voice her needs without apologizing for having them. "Good," Sarah said. "Hard, but good. We talked about boundaries, about how saying yes to everyone else's needs usually means saying no to my own." David nodded with the understanding of someone who'd been doing his own work. His therapist, Dr. Marcus Chen, no relation to Dr. James Chen, though the coincidence of names hadn't been lost on any of them, specialized in high-achieving men who'd lost themselves in their careers. The sessions had been brutal at first, forcing David to confront the deep-seated insecurities that had driven him to seek validation through work. "Speaking of boundaries," David said carefully, "Hartman called again yesterday." Sarah felt her stomach tighten with the familiar anxiety that came whenever David's old life intruded on their new one. Richard Hartman had not taken David's leave of absence well, and his periodic attempts to lure him back to the firm had become a recurring source of tension. What did he want this time? "The Patterson merger. They said they need someone with my expertise, that it's worth $5 million to the firm and potentially 7 figures in bonus money for whoever handles it." A year ago, David would have been packed and ready to return to the office before Hartman had finished making his pitch. The money alone would have been impossible to resist, never mind the professional validation of being considered indispensable. "What did you tell him?" David reached across the table and took her hand. His thumb traced gentle circles across her knuckles. It was such a small gesture, but it spoke volumes about how much had changed between them. Physical affection had returned gradually, carefully, like trust rebuilt one touch at a time. "I told him I wasn't available. I told him I've discovered there are more important things than 7-figure bonuses." Sarah felt something warm spread through her chest. Not relief. She was past the point of holding her breath every time David's old world called, but gratitude. Gratitude that he'd learned to choose them without her having to ask, without her having to explain why it mattered. "How did that feel?" she asked. "Terrifying," David admitted with a laugh, "and liberating. It's still weird turning down that kind of money, but then I remember what we're building now, and suddenly it doesn't seem like such a sacrifice."
What they were building. Sarah liked that phrase, the way it acknowledged that their marriage wasn't something they'd restored, but something entirely new they were creating together. The old marriage had been built on compromise and accommodation and the careful management of disappointment. This one was being constructed with honesty and presence and the daily practice of choosing each other. It hadn't been easy. The first few months after their revelation had been brutal, full of arguments that finally surfaced decades of buried resentment. David had struggled with the transition from high-powered attorney to whatever he was becoming. Sarah had struggled with learning to ask for what she needed instead of just accepting what she was given. They'd both struggled with trusting that the changes were real and lasting, rather than just temporary responses to crisis. "How's the consulting business?" Sarah asked, changing the subject to lighter ground. David's face brightened. 6 months ago, he'd started a small legal consulting firm that specialized in helping other attorneys find work-life balance. The irony wasn't lost on any of them, but David had discovered a passion for preventing other people from making the mistakes he'd made. His client base was growing slowly but steadily, built on word-of-mouth recommendations from lawyers who were tired of billing their lives away. "Good, actually. I signed 2 new clients this week, both partners at big firms who are on the verge of losing their families if they don't make changes.
It's rewarding work, helping people see that there's life beyond the office. And the money? Sarah asked, because practical matters still mattered, even in their new paradigm. About a third of what I was making at Hartman, David said without flinching, but enough to live comfortably, especially since we downsized the house. They'd sold the Tudor mansion on Elm Street 8 months ago, trading it for a smaller craftsman bungalow closer to downtown. The new house had character instead of prestige, comfort instead of grandeur. Sarah had fallen in love with its built-in bookshelves and cozy kitchen, with the way natural light streamed through windows that didn't need to impress anyone. Any regrets? She asked, a question that had become part of their regular check-ins. About the money? Sometimes. About the status? Occasionally. About choosing this life over that one? Never. It was the right answer. But more than that, it was an honest answer. David had learned to acknowledge the difficulty of his choices without romanticizing them. Some days he missed the adrenaline rush of high-stakes negotiations and the validation that came with being considered one of the city's top attorneys. But those feelings no longer controlled his decisions. Michael's coming for dinner Sunday. He's bringing someone he wants us to meet. The David's eyebrows rose with interest. Their son had been dating casually since graduation, but this was the first time he'd wanted them to meet anyone. The significance wasn't lost on either parent. What do we know about her? Her name is Alana Rodriguez. She's a pediatric resident at UCSF, and according to Michael, she's brilliant and beautiful and laughs at his jokes even when they're not funny. David chuckled. Sounds serious. It does. And you know what? I'm not worried about it. The admission surprised even Sarah. For so long, she had been anxious about Michael's romantic relationships, terrified that he'd repeat the patterns he had observed in their marriage.
Watching him navigate the world as a confident young man who knew his worth, who'd learned to expect real partnership from the people he loved, filled her with pride instead of fear. "He's not going to make our mistakes," David said, reading her thoughts with the intuition that had developed between them over months of brutal honesty. "He knows what love is supposed to look like now, because we've finally learned how to show him." Their relationship with Michael had deepened over the past 18 months, becoming more authentic as the three of them learned to relate to each other without the buffer of secrets and assumptions. They'd had the conversation with Dr. James Chen, a difficult but necessary discussion that had given Michael medical history and context for some of his personality traits. Dr. Chen, now retired and living in Oregon, had been gracious and understanding, expressing gratitude that his biological son had been raised by such devoted parents. Michael had also met his half-sister, Dr. Chen's daughter, with his wife, and they'd developed a friendly correspondence that satisfied Michael's curiosity about his genetic heritage without threatening the primacy of his relationship with David. It was a delicate balance, but one they'd all navigated with remarkable maturity. "I have something to tell you," Sarah said, her tone shifting to something more serious. David's attention sharpened, but without the fear that would have accompanied such a statement in the past. They'd learned to trust that difficult conversations were just part of maintaining an honest relationship, not necessarily harbingers of catastrophe. "I got a call from Jennifer Martindale yesterday about the divorce papers, and I'm withdrawing them." David went very still, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. They'd left the legal paperwork in limbo for over a year, neither moving forward with the divorce nor officially canceling it. It had felt like insurance, Sarah supposed, a safety net in case their reconciliation efforts failed. "Are you sure?" he asked carefully. "I'm sure. This isn't the same marriage I wanted to escape from, David. These aren't the same people who were slowly killing each other with resentment and neglect. I want to be married to you, not the you I thought I could change, but the you that you've chosen to become." David set down his coffee cup and reached for both of her hands, holding them gently across the small table. His eyes were bright with unshed tears, and Sarah could see the weight of relief and gratitude in his expression. "I love you," he said simply. "I love the woman you've become, the woman you always were underneath all the accommodating and self-sacrifice. I love how strong you are now, how clearly you see what you need and want. I love that you chose to stay and fight for us."
I love you too, Sarah replied. I love that you learned how to be present. I love that you choose our family every day, even when work is calling. I love that you're brave enough to keep doing this hard work even when it's uncomfortable. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, holding hands across the table while the coffee shop bustled around them. Sarah thought about how different this scene was from all those dinners they'd shared in expensive restaurants, making polite conversation while their marriage slowly starved to death. This felt real in a way those interactions never had. What should we do to celebrate? David asked. Withdrawing divorce papers seems like it deserves some kind of acknowledgement. Sarah laughed, surprised by the lightness she felt. A year ago, the idea of celebrating their marriage would have seemed absurd. Now it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Let's go home. Let's cook dinner together and drink that bottle of wine we've been saving. Let's call Michael and tell him his parents are staying married. Let's just be happy. Simple happiness. When did that become such a radical concept? When we stopped believing we deserved it. They left the coffee shop hand in hand, walking slowly through the tree-lined streets of their neighborhood. The California sun was beginning its descent toward the Pacific, painting everything in golden light that made even ordinary moments feel touched with magic.
At home, they moved through the familiar dance of preparing dinner together, a routine they'd developed over the past year that felt both domestic and romantic. David chopped vegetables while Sarah seasoned chicken, and they talked about their days, about Elena Rodriguez and Sunday dinner plans, about the small and large moments that made up a life. Later, after they'd called Michael with their news and listened to him whoop with joy over the phone, after they'd opened the good wine and toasted their imperfect, hard-won happiness, they sat on their back porch and watched the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't gone through all this?" Sarah asked. "If Michael hadn't asked me why I stay? If I hadn't seen the lawyer? If we'd just kept drifting along the way we were?" David considered the question seriously. We would have divorced eventually. Maybe not for another 5 years, maybe not until Michael got married and we had to face how empty the house felt with just the two of us rattling around in it. But we would have ended, Sarah. We were already ending. And now? Now we're beginning, he said simply. Every day, we're choosing to begin again. Sarah leaned against his shoulder, breathing in the scent of jasmine from their neighbor's garden and feeling profoundly grateful for the circuitous path that had brought them to this moment. It hadn't been the story she'd expected when she married David 30 years ago, hadn't been the fairy tale she'd hoped for when they'd brought Michael home from the hospital 23 years ago. But it was real. It was honest. It was built on the solid foundation of two people who'd learned to choose each other not out of fear or obligation, but out of genuine love and respect, and the daily decision to show up for their shared life. "I'm proud of us," she said into the gathering darkness. Yeah, we could have given up. We could have accepted that some things are too broken to be fixed. We could have decided it was easier to start over with new people than to do the work of becoming new people ourselves. But we didn't. And look what we built instead. Above them, the stars grew brighter as the sky deepened from purple to black. Inside the house, their wedding photos sat on bookshelves next to pictures from Michael's graduation, from family vacations taken after they'd learned to actually be present with each other, from quiet moments that had seemed ordinary at the time but had become precious in retrospect. It wasn't a perfect life. There were still days when David struggled with the transition from high-powered attorney to something gentler and more sustainable. There were still moments when Sarah had to consciously choose to voice her needs instead of swallowing them for the sake of peace. There were still times when the old patterns tried to reassert themselves, when work threatened to pull David back into his previous obsessions, when Sarah felt the familiar urge to accommodate rather than communicate. But they'd learned to catch themselves in those moments, to remember what they'd built together and what they stood to lose if they stopped fighting for it. They'd learned that love wasn't a feeling that happened to them, but a choice they made every day, sometimes multiple times a day.
She hoped they would find the courage to ask different questions,
She hoped they would discover that it was never too late to choose differently, to demand more, to build something real from the ashes of something that had stopped working long ago. But mostly, she hoped they would learn what she and David had learned, that the best love stories aren't about perfect people finding each other, but about imperfect people choosing each other, again and again, until choosing became as natural as breathing. The porch light cast a warm glow around them as they finally headed inside, ready for sleep and dreams and another day of choosing each other. In the morning, there would be coffee and conversation and the small moments that added up to a life worth living. In the morning, there would be love that looked like showing up, like being present, like two people who'd finally learned what it meant to mean everything to each other. But tonight, there was just this, the quiet satisfaction of two people who'd found their way home to each other, despite everything that had tried to keep them apart. If Sarah and David's journey from the brink of divorce to genuine love touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and subscribe for more stories that prove it's never too late to choose love over convenience. Your engagement helps me continue creating these cinematic tales that remind us all what real love looks like. Thank you for being part of this community that believes in second chances and the power of choosing each other every single day. This cinematic story journey from abandonment to revelation to redemption shows how love can be rebuilt on a foundation of truth, presence, and the daily choice to fight for each other. Sometimes the most powerful love stories aren't about finding the right person, but about choosing to become the right people for each other.